Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi, this is Alex Stein, co-host of Mushing Radio on Dogworks Radio. We just completed our first storytelling season on the 1925 Serum Run. Almost 100 years later, the 1925 Serum Run is something that is still inspirational, amazing, and in many ways larger than life. We've gathered all of these episodes together on one page to make it easier for you to listen to them in order. Just go to dogworksradio.com/serumrun. That's SERUMRUN, no space, dogworksradio.com/serumrun. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to Dogworks Radio at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is that you go to listen to podcasts.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on Dogworks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog, available on Dogworks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. And you can hear all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Make sure you follow us on social media, searching for Dogworks Radio, and be sure you hit that subscribe button on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows. Joining us from California is our co-host. His name is Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. It's been unseasonably cold here in Los Angeles, which I think is a good way of preparing me to be up in Alaska, where I'm sure it will be really cold and not just unseasonably cold.
You know, you're coming up here in about a week to join in the Iditarod festivities. They're already getting kicked off with a lot of mushers doing the EKG tests, which are required for all the teams. And then next week really kicks it off with the vet checks and the banquet and the ceremonial start and the meet the mushers and all of that. When you come up as a fan, Alex, what are you looking for aside from just the ceremonial start and the restart up in Willow?
You know, I just love really the entire atmosphere of it. So I love being around the other fans. I love talking to people. I love meeting people who've come from all over the country or all over the world to see the start of Iditarod. And I love the way Anchorage in particular and Alaska in general sort of, gather together to celebrate the Iditarod every year.
And you know, this weekend is also the start of the world-famous Fur Rondy, and the Fur Rondy sled dog races happen over the next 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. By the time this airs, of course, that will be over, but at least gives people an idea of what happens. And that's a huge carnival atmosphere. They have all sorts of events, including the Mushers and Trappers Ball. They have a carnival. They have the fur auction, all of that. So it is a good time to be up in Alaska, isn't it?
It really is. And my wife and I were up there a long time ago, and we went to, I don't know if they still do this, but they had ice bowling in back of one of the bars in Anchorage, and they set up these lanes on a frozen creek, and they had real bowling balls, and you just bowled.
You know,
which was silly and very fun.
Yeah, they do all sorts of events like that. Of course, they do the running of the reindeer down 4th Avenue here in Anchorage. They do a fat tire bike race. They do snowshoe football. They even have, I think it's the largest snowball fight in the world here in Anchorage during that time. So lots of fun events for everyone, not including just the races and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if anyone likes Alaska and likes cold weather, I would really encourage them to come up to Fur Rondy one year because it is really, really fun.
And speaking of being really fun up here in Alaska, of course, we think about snow. And for the last few years at the Rondi and also the Iditarod, we've been biting our nails a little bit, wondering about if there's going to be enough snow for the race. And just this morning, as I sit here and record, it's Thursday the 22nd. We got about 5 inches of snow here in Willow, which is the start of the actual race, the Iditarod, in 2 weeks or so. So it's a great conditions out there. Looking forward to having a great trail for the mushers as they head down towards Nome in a couple weeks.
Right. And for people who aren't as familiar with the race, usually what happens is, or at least in the past few years, there hasn't been very much snow in the first third of the race. So going over the Alaska range, it's been really, really spotty. And that's been very, very difficult and has taken a huge toll on mushers, sleds, and not so much on dogs, but a really big toll on mushers. So it is fantastic this year that there is more snow cover and hopefully a much better trail.
Well, speaking about being all for the dogs, that is going to be our topic today. Anything else you want to mention up to the lead up for Iditarod, or should we jump right into our topic?
Let's jump right in.
All right. Our buddy Craig Medred, he is a journalist and a writer over at craigmedred.news. He released an article today titled All About the Dogs, and it is pretty much outlining a schedule for mushing, a schedule for Iditarod and mushing in terms of making it better for the dogs. And he is outlining having an equal run-rest schedule throughout the race, and it would be a requirement using GPS trackers to figure out when that run race schedule works appropriately. So, for example, if you run 6 hours, you have to rest 6 hours, or if you run 8 hours, you have to rest 8 hours. What are your initial thoughts on that before we jump into sort of the particulars?
It seems like that would be very, very difficult to do, and I think there would be a lot of pushback from the mushers. It used to be, when Iditarod first started, that there was kind of a rule of thumb that people would have run-rest schedules that were equal. So, as you said, if you ran for 4 hours, you'd rest for 4 hours. If you ran for 8 hours, you'd rest for 8 hours, although I don't think back then many people ran for 8 hours straight. But as the dogs have gotten stronger, as the race has gotten quicker and more competitive, people have been pushing that over the years. And for a while, it was rather than 1-to-1, it was 1.5-to-1. So you'd run for 6 hours and then you'd rest for 4 hours. And a lot of people have been pushing that over the past 10 or 15 years to the point where it's now not uncommon to see 1 or 2 mushers every year or every other year who will basically run almost for 24 hours straight with a few breaks, or will run for like 18 hours with a few breaks. And there's been a lot of controversy about how dogs are able to make up for that afterwards, and whether that is just too stressful for the dogs.
Right, and the article with that Medred starts off with is he talks about sort of the physiological components of a dog's need for rest, and he says that it's approximately 10 hours for the average pet dog. The average couch potato dog sleeps about 10 hours, and then when you talk about canine athletes, it reaches up to about 12 hours for that maximum benefit in terms of recovery. Now, that does not mean that they have to do it all at once. As we know, just having our own pet dogs, very rarely will your pet sleep through the night. He's up and down, jumping on the bed, getting drinks of water and all that sort of stuff throughout the night, and sort of doing more napping than sleeping. But if they have that extended amount of sleep, of course, that enhances recovery, just like it does with us.
Right. And it's a very difficult thing because as dogs have been run more with less rest, I believe that the amount of time that a dog is competitive as a race dog has slipped back. So rather than having a dog that will be competitive for 7 or 8 years, you're having dogs who whose competitive lives are much shorter. Not that their lives in general are shorter, but their competitive lives will maybe be 3 or 4 years instead of 7 or 8.
Right. He also speaks about that in the article as well, and he was talking about Rick Swenson's Andy, who lived to be 20 years old, and I believe he was still mushing at the age of 10. And the same can be said with Susan Butcher's Granite and some other famous lead dogs. And he brought up the point with an interview that was taken place by, I believe it was both Mitch and Dallas, and they were touting that they only had 4-year-olds in lead on their team. So a much younger dog was doing things at a capacity that these older dogs were doing a couple of decades before.
Yeah. And, just as with people, as we get older, we are not able to physically perform in the same way that we were as younger men and women, but we get more knowledge and we're able to use that knowledge, hopefully, to be more efficient. And I think the same can be said to a certain extent with sled dogs, and especially with lead dogs. They gain a lot of experience, they gain a lot of knowledge about the trail and about trail conditions, and maybe are not as fast as the 4 or 5-year-olds, but I think you're also losing a lot when you stop having older dogs who are able to perform and lead.
Right. And Medred brought up the point about it becomes a strategy if this were to become in effect, this equal run rest strategy. And he outlined some examples, and one would be sort of backloading your time, meaning you're going you're resting more at the beginning to have a little bit more in the tank at the end, and he equated that to a lot of the way that marathoners run, human marathoners, where they they will sort of run a slower race at the beginning and then sort of put the pedal to the metal at the end, but they do it at a pace where they're resting, if you can rest, on a marathon much easier at the beginning before they really have to push themselves at the end. And he talked about a strategy about how you can do this by the much slower portions of the race were the first third as they go over the Alaska range, and the dogs are going slower through worse conditions, the mountains and the snow and all that. And then when they get to the coast, they have a little bit more freedom to run, and they can put that pedal to the metal. So it would be a strategy to figure out when that run rest schedule would come in. And I think it's interesting because if they did do it with the GPS trackers, could those same dogs, as you mentioned, that run the first 24 hours without stopping, and I know there's been several mushers in recent times that have done that. Martin Booser is one that I think about right off the top in the last few years. He did that, especially when they were running here in the South versus in Fairbanks, where he would go all the way to like Roan or somewhere like that and really just rock and roll. And then he would take a big long rest, and then he would rest for quite a while, and then he would go again. But he ended up flaming out a little bit and didn't do as well because he jumped so far into the lead. So what are your thoughts on that sort of strategy process of it?
I think it's a very interesting thing because it would slow the race down a little, but it would, as you said, make it much more strategic and make really the knowledge of dogs and the knowledge of the trail play a much more important role. So I'm intrigued from that point. I find the idea of, anyone who's had the Iditarod Insider and has spent time looking at the trackers know that there are frequently long periods of time where individual trackers are not pinging right, or where the tracker information just is not reliable. And that's not to say that the trackers aren't worth anything, because it's great to have them, as opposed to in the years when you were just hitting the refresh button over and over on the standings page. But I'm wondering if it's smart to put so much trust into the trackers, knowing that they're not always as reliable as they should be. And the second point I wanted to make is that I'm a little bit reluctant to go back all the way to the days of equal run rest. And the reason is that while I do think it's possible to push dogs too far, and while I do think it's definitely possible that some of the emphasis on turning this into a 1,000-mile speed event have have at times resulted in things that are harmful to the dogs. The dogs have sled dogs in the last 10 or 15 years have shown us that they are really capable of a lot more than people used to think they were capable of. I think back to Lance Mackey being the first person to run the Yukon Quest and Iditarod in the same year with essentially the same dog teams. And people thought it's not possible to run a 1,000-mile race with dogs and then turn around, a week or so later or 2 weeks later and run another 1,000-mile race. And he proved that not only could you do that, but you could win. And that really changed the thinking of how people view what the stamina of dogs can be and what they can be capable of. So, my feeling is that people may be pushing this a little bit too far, but I'm not sure that going back to the strategy of how dogs were run in the 70s or 80s is really the answer.
And that brings up my next point. In Medred's article, he talked about Joe May had produced a schedule where he would run 4 hours, rest 4 hours, run 4 hours, rest 4 hours, run 4 hours, rest 6, and then continue on the trail that way. And Rick Swenson used that in his rookie year, and he was really struggling at the beginning of the race, and he remembered what Joe May had said, and he put that rest schedule into effect and did very well. Ended up coming in 11th place as a rookie, which is a great finish even back in the day. And he said he equated it to those extra couple of hours when he would rest those 6 hours versus the 4. And he stood by that strategy for quite a while and ended up doing really well, of course, throughout his racing career. And he said he was very close to beating mushers like Susan Butcher and Rick Mackey and the like because of that very established and closer together run rest schedule that they had. Even though it was, well, I guess that's 38 years ago, it's still employed a little bit as it is today.
Right. And, I think there's a lot that we can learn from going back and looking at how people like Joe May and Rick Swenson ran some of these earlier races, even though they were a long time ago. And sometimes it feels like some of the dog drivers, especially some of the younger ones, are so enamored of people who've been very successful in the last 5 or 10 years that they've kind of lost track of some of the earlier pioneers. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from them.
And I'm reading through some of the comments on his article, and they talk a lot about speed. And, does speed come into a factor even though you're doing these equal run rests? And Craig says in one of his comments that he thinks that we're at the top or the near of the limits in terms of speed. And he says equal run rests increases speed by just 0.2 miles an hour between rest and more rest wins. So what do you think about that? Even though we have a different type of race, if we did this, do you think it would become much faster even though they were resting more?
I think that probably the dogs are going to run faster just because athletes of all kinds tend to get better as time goes on with better training or better equipment or whatever. I look at distance runners. Human distance runners are so much faster now than they were 70 years ago, for example. So I think it will get faster. The other thing to keep in mind is that the trail is totally different from how it was in the 70s and 80s. So, we have really a much more manicured and well kept after trail, especially for the people at the front of the pack. The snow machiners go out and they break the trail. And as we talked about before, snowshoes are required equipment because there's a possibility you might need to break trail. But for most for most Iditarod mushers who are running these days, they've never had to use their snowshoes on Iditarod. So it's a better trail, and that makes it possible to run faster. But I think also the dogs are getting better, and so they'll continue to just incrementally run faster as time goes on.
Right, exactly. So, it's an interesting proposal. It would be interesting to see if anything comes of this. I know that there's been a lot of talk about this for a long time, but it's also interesting this year, Alex, this is the first time in several years that it's running the southern route, and I know that they're going to run that same southern route for the next couple of years, and that's through the village of Iditarod, and more typically it alternates back and forth between the years, and in the last couple of years they've had to do that Fairbanks route where they go Fairbanks to Nenana, then on that river up to Hooslia and all. So do you think that there's going to be a little bit different strategy now, meaning it's been so long ago in terms of Iditarod history, I guess, that they're running on a route that they haven't ran in a while?
I think it's going to be interesting for mushers who have not run this route ever, or mushers who haven't run it in a while. And I think it's going to really require a lot more flexibility, and I think it's going to require people who are able to think more on their feet. And not that I don't want to say that I think mushing is ever easy, but I think that there are going to be challenges that people are going to face this year on this southern route that they haven't faced in a while.
Very good. So, Alex, what are your final thoughts on this sort of new rule proposal, this run-rest schedule, and figuring out a way to track it, whether using GPS or some other means? Are you for this or against it?
I think I'm against it as it's being presented here, but I'm not against the general idea. And I don't know if the right number is 1-to-1 or, some other number, 1.25-to-1 or something. But I am not at all opposed to the idea of having more mandatory rests and figuring out a way to get the run rest cycle a little bit more in line.
I would have to say that I am for it. I think that if they could figure out a way to keep it equal and keep it as a strategy, if everyone was required to do, if they ran 10 hours and they had to rest 10, I think that would be a very interesting strategy compared to what's happening now. And I think it would change sort of the outcome of the race. I think that folks would definitely be different in terms of how they plan for the race, and we've talked a lot about Dallas Seavey's strategy of what was he called, unleashing the monster when he gets to Unaclete, and really just puts that pedal to the metal and keeps a pretty conservative race up until that point. So I think that would change that strategy as well. And then of course there's all the things that come into play with that that have been talked about and changed over the last couple of years with the use of trailers and the non-use of trailers and the ban of the trailers for the rest of the dogs and all that sort of stuff. So I think that this is sort of a progression for today's Iditarod, and I think that this is one of those things that's going to become a determining factor in how it proceeds in the future, because it is not, as you mentioned, that same race as it was in the 1970s or 1980s.
Yeah, to put it in to use a different, a totally different metaphor for this. In Hollywood, there used to be something called the Hays Code, and in addition to not allowing profanity, there were other rules, like you couldn't show a couple in bed together, and you couldn't show toilets, and there were all sorts of things that you couldn't do. And as a result of that, people who were making movies would find all kinds of creative and wonderful ways to express these things. And nowadays, we can show people in bed together, we can show toilets, we can curse a blue streak. And yet there sometimes, even though there's more freedom that way, it seems like some of the creativity has been lost. And what is very appealing to me about this proposal is it seems to be a way to bring more creativity and strategy back into a race, which I think is becoming in danger of becoming just a long sprint.
Right. Well, leave it to the Hollywood types to bring up a Hollywood metaphor. I appreciate that, Alex.
There you go.
That's definitely cool for sure that you can bring that perspective as well. Guys, we're just about out of time here, and I'm going to make sure that we link over to Craig Medred's article, It's All About the Dogs, which was released today on the 22nd of February. And if you guys have comments or questions about sort of our thoughts on this, please leave us a message over on any of the social media channels. And make sure you follow us along on the trail as we start to talk about the 2018 Iditarod. Alex, we'll talk again soon, okay?
Yep. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our DogWorks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about DogWorks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
DogWorks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. DogWorks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dog Works at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.